Hey, welcome back everyone. Our next speaker is here at our on-premise virtual Azure Community Day location, and his name is Maarten Goet. Maarten, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
So Maarten, you are an MVP and RD for many years already. Also organizer of Experts Live.
Yeah.
How about the plans with Experts Live?
Yeah, so in November we're actually trying to do a new Experts Live, and like's happening here, it will be mostly virtual event.
Right.
Details will come after the summer, but we're trying to get something together also globally.
Cool.
And yes, I'm also an MV dinosaur, like you said, since 07.
I like that name. Yeah.
Started out as System Center Operations Manager, or even Microsoft Operations Manager at the time.
Wow.
And an RD since 15, yeah.
Cool, all right. And I know one of your hobbies is like flying planes, right? You're a pilot.
Yes.
But I'm really wondering, did you already pre-order the new flight simulator?
I did, yes,
Yeah?
Flight Simulator 2020.
Nice.
I had the opportunity to see the preview earlier this year, and I was blown away by the graphics and the reality of it.
Yeah.
The scenery, the weather that's factored in. Actually, although I fly and have my pilot's license, I did order the Logitech set to use alongside the flight sim, so I can fly it home from the chair now, hopefully next month.
Wow, okay.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, the previous version was from many years ago, right?
Quite old,
I think
right?
it was Flight Simulator X. I'm not sure when it was released, but it was many years ago.
Yeah.
And you see that AI made a difference now because how the weather factors in, how it behaves, and how your plane will then actually react to the weather that's happening really outside, but then in your game. Mind blowing.
Yeah.
Mind blowing.
Yeah, really looking forward to that.
That's really cool. Cool. Okay, so you're going to talk about, I think, your favorite subject, right? Azure Sentinel. I mean, you even walked in here with a jacket with the Azure Sentinel.
Fully corporate branded Azure Sentinel,
Okay.
And the reason is it's happening to everybody at this point in time. We have so many people, customers that we talk to that get hit by ransomware, for instance, and their systems are shut down. They don't know what to do next, and they're calling us to help. And from those lessons learned, I'm trying to help everybody get to a better security posture, because once we get the security posture better, then hopefully we can fend off some of these attacks, because they're crippling to schools, to healthcare systems, to hospitals, and hopefully I can make a difference by spreading some of the love for Azure Sentinel and Microsoft Threat Protection.
Yeah, so you are actually using Sentinel for your customers, right? For production environments of customers,
Yeah, we see quite a ramp up. A lot of customers are trying it out because it's just a service you can try out in Azure, and I'll talk about it in the session. But on the other hand, then they need to run a 24/7 operation on top of it, which is hard. Most people want to be in bed. Maybe if they're following the virtual Azure Community Day, they don't want to be in bed.
No.
But other than that, they do want to be in bed, so they're often outsourcing it.
Right.
But we see quite a big uptake with other products as well, like Microsoft Defender and Cloud App Security, Azure AD Identity Protection.
Right,
There's so many security properties within Microsoft, and Sentinel ties it together, and I'll show you how these things come together.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
I think we're ready for it, so please take the stage.
All right, Olga.
Show us.
Will do.
Good luck.
All right. So let's talk about Azure Sentinel, and the session's called the Complete Overview because we want to take you through everything Azure Sentinel can do, and of course all of the things that it brings being an Azure security service. Now, as discussed, I'm Maarten Goet. I run the security division at Wortel, and I'm an MVP since 2007 and an RD since 15. I fly the real clouds, and I'm the founder of Experts Live. So before we dive into the Azure security products and before we dive into Azure Sentinel, I'd like to take you to where we are today, really the state of the union, and like we just discussed in the intro, what's happening in the world and why you should look at trying to improve your security posture. If you looked at the last 10 years, you saw a big shift from going from on-premises data centers all the way into cloud. And we see that if you're now engineering an application today, and it's a new application, you're often using public services, things like Azure PaaS services or some of the other clouds, and you're trying to engineer things in the cloud and less in your data center. Of course, today we're still in a mixed situation, a hybrid situation. There will be connectivity to your data center alongside the cloud, but we're rapidly shifting as everybody's seeing into a public cloud. And it means that we have a new world to defend. This on-premises was really about almost having a moat around your data center, making sure that on a network level things were secured with a firewall or some other devices, and that way we could control traffic coming in and out of our data center and in and out of our application. Now with the cloud, that's different. We have many services that either are exposed through virtual networking, through a mixed configuration with a hybrid world, or maybe these endpoints are configured to be exposed to the internet directly. That means that we have other connectivity types to worry about, we have other types of services to worry about, and it's not only VMs that we need to protect. We see PaaS services, we see management APIs, we see storage containers, and all of these things could potentially be a pivot point for a malicious attacker to come into your application and into your data. So there's this new world to defend, and that really requires a new mindset, I would say. And if we look at that cloud defender mindset, we see that there's a couple of comparisons we can make. For on-premises, we had this server to worry about. In the cloud, this would be a service, whether it's PaaS, IaaS, or something else. In on-premises, we had a domain like an Active Directory forest. In Azure, we need to worry about our subscription and who's the subscription admin, who's the owner, and who can access some of these rights in Azure. We worried about pass-the-hash on-premises. Now it's really about credential pivots in the public cloud. Private IPs are largely shifting to become public IPs, and access control lists are now becoming things like network security groups in Azure. And where we really looked at RDP, SSH, VNC, and other types of screen control within the cloud and the public cloud, we see that we need to think about management APIs that need to be well configured and protected against malicious use. So we need a new cloud defender mindset to make sure that we defend the right things once we're in that mixed or fully cloud native situation. Looking at some of these SIMs, the traditional SIM really required a lot of infrastructure maintenance. So if you wanted to collect security events and put them into a traditional SIM, you had servers, you had storage, you had to maintain all of that equipment. And that took away hours from really spending in defense against attackers and malicious activities. Now, collecting all the data from your data center was also a daunting task, making sure that we have all of these separate products that are collecting back into a SIM, and then we need to normalize so that we see that an IP address in table 1 is also the IP address in table 2, and the same goes for things like usernames, so that we can correlate information and make sure that we track and see steps happening across the cyber kill chain. Now, we do get a lot of signals coming in with so many data. It's really hard to make sense of it all. How do we know that in this bulk of data there's this 1 or 2 events that we need to worry about and really think about picking up and analyzing a bit more to see if it's a true attacker we're seeing? And there's many disconnected and separate products. So we saw security solutions from vendor 1, security solutions from vendor 2, and many other things that you then need to integrate and need to make sure that you see the information on top of, which is hard if they're coming from different vendors. And like we saw in the previous slide, defending the cloud really requires a different skill and tool set. So we need to adopt largely new products and a new way of working to make sure that we defend the right thing and can work with them on the right way. Now, this is where Azure Sentinel comes in. And Azure Sentinel, for those that don't know it, that's a service that Microsoft launched last year in 2019 and really is a cloud-native SIM, a cloud-native way of controlling your security events and collecting your security events. It's a service that lives in Microsoft Azure. You can just enable it and then you can start using it with the data you ingest. It has almost limitless cloud speed and scale. And the scale makes a lot of sense because if you're coming in with quite a number of data, you need to make sure that you can store them. Maybe you have a regulation that requires you to store it for a couple of years. And so scale matters. but also speed matters, because if you're using machine learning, if you're using artificial intelligence, you need a burst of computing extra at a moment's notice, and these are things that are hard to do in your own data center. So having limitless cloud speed and scale from Azure helps to become really an effective SIEM and security solution. And Azure Sentinel has machine learning built in. Some of the other properties that Microsoft has in Azure come together in Azure Sentinel to provide you with machine learning models. And these models have been battle tested at scale at Microsoft platforms, at Microsoft Azure and Office 365. And you've already seen them, for instance, with Azure AD Identity Protection. And now they're being carried over to Azure Sentinel to make use on top of all of that other security data that you're ingesting. Now there's also easy integration, because if you're running Office 365, if you're running Azure AD, if you're maybe consuming some of the other Microsoft services, we can just with the click of a button enable those services to come in with their audit logs, with their security logs, and make sure that we see those and start acting on malicious use. But I'll show you in a couple of seconds that it's not only limited to Microsoft services, we can really much embrace any of the other services that you have in your environment alongside of those Microsoft services. And of course, being at a cloud service, you just pay for what you use. You pay for the data that's stored in the log analytics workspace, and you pay for the retention as long as that you need to store that data. But there's no pricing models around events per second or some of these things that traditional SIEMs do. Now, Azure Sentinel became general available in the fall of last year, so it's pretty much now available in any of the Azure regions where the log analytics workspace is available. So you can just go ahead and try it out in your region to see how Azure Sentinel works and how to use it. Now, the question I get a lot is, do I still need Azure Security Center? And that's a good question, because I would say yes, you would need Azure Security Center. Azure Security Center is workload protection. So if you have Linux VMs, if you have Kubernetes clusters and anything else, Azure Security Center will help you make sure those are well configured and secured. They will detect attacks, maybe like crypto miners and such. But it also adds other items like just-in-time access, some compliancy reporting, some centralized UI. So Azure Security Center is still a good option to use in your Azure subscription. And it's actually one of the sources we can take into Azure Sentinel and get some information from to understand your security posture in all of those resources that are connected to Azure Security Center. Now, the architecture is actually quite straightforward. It's based on Microsoft Azure, so everything you already know and love about Microsoft Azure applies. There's Azure Active Directory, there's the enterprise grade of the platform, there's continuity and availability that you already get from Microsoft Azure. Now, underlying it uses an Azure Log Analytics workspace, and probably you're already familiar with those. They empower things like Azure Monitor, Azure Security Center, and others. So the Log Analytics is a workspace where we will store the data for you and where your security events will live. And that can be scaled as much as that Log Analytics allows you to do so. On top of the Log Analytics workspace, you enable Sentinel as a feature, and so you can be very granular on which Log Analytics workspaces you want to enable it. Maybe have one centralized or have one per region for a follow the sun principle. And you can also create a new Log Analytics workspace if you want, and really create a new Azure Sentinel and Central SIEM. If you want to understand what are the pros and cons and get some design considerations, actually on my blog I've written a lengthy article on the things that you could think about when trying to pick whether to use a current Log Analytics workspace or try to use a new Log Analytics workspace. Either works. On top of Azure Sentinel or on top of Log Analytics, we'll be using KQL, the Kusto query language. And that's something you might already be familiar with, again, because if you're using Azure Monitor, if you're using Azure Security Center, that's already KQL based. And you see a lot of Microsoft products now adopting KQL, like the Data Explorer and such. And it's a really powerful and easy way to work with the data that's part of that Log Analytics workspace. Now, if you've not used Kusto query language before, then one of my tips would be is to go to Pluralsight. because Robert Kane actually authored a free course that you can take. It's about 3.5 hours long, and you go from all the basic commands into the most advanced commands and really understand how to work with the data, do things like time series and such. And it's something that carries quite forward in all of these Microsoft services. So I would urge you to have a look at that course if you want to use Azure Sentinel or any of the KQL-based services. Again, because it's free, so you can just go to Pluralsight and take it there in any shape, way or form. Now that we have a log analytics workspace and you might have Azure Sentinel running and you understand the architecture, the next thing we'll do is to fill it up with the data that you'll be using. And for that we have integrations. We have something called the connector framework. And these connectors allow you to flow in the data from these other systems into Azure Sentinel centrally. And here's just a few on this slide, but currently, and you'll see that in the demo, there's about 52 connectors that are available to you from Azure Sentinel. And there's many more third parties and custom integrations that you can use. Now, of course, if you're using Microsoft properties, you can connect with a click of the button Azure AD Identity Protection, Microsoft Cloud App Security, and any of the others that you see here. We also have connectors for competing platforms, so like AWS, maybe the Google Cloud, some of the semantic AV and such, because we understand that you need to do security centrally, so we'll allow you to source in those systems as well. And of course, importantly, the network system. So for all of the major vendors like Palo Alto, Cisco, Barracuda, and many more, you'll find connectors out of the box. And then you can just take syslog or the common event framework to source those events into Azure Sentinel and start working with those from some of the alert rules. So from this, we can create one SIM for all your clouds. I presented earlier this month on the Cloud Security Meetup in London a session about AWS monitoring with Azure Sentinel. And go ahead and look that back if you want way more detail on this, because I did a 45-minute demo on how to detect the Capital One breach that occurred a couple of years earlier. Now, this AWS connector allows you to connect into AWS CloudTrail. So anything happening in the AWS platform, you can just take and put them into Azure Sentinel. And the great thing is that some of these rules that you get out of the box correlate information between both AWS and Azure. So if you have a username in your AD tenant and you have a username and IAM credential in AWS, will actually understand these things, correlate them for you, and give you alerts whether or not things are happening successfully in those platforms. So that means that we can have one SIM for all your clouds. We can go all the way down to AWS S3 bucket logging. We can have Azure AD tenant logging and anything that you need for your security posture. Now, what about my custom data? Because maybe you have a custom enterprise application that you need logging for. Maybe there's this third-party system that you want to log into Azure Sentinel. Now, a lot of these security solutions that you have today are built on things like Logstash, Elastic, Kibana, maybe some other forwarding system. And these are things that apply to Azure Sentinel as well. So if you have invested today in methods like Logstash, that's perfectly fine. We can add this as an extra destination and make sure that we get these events as well. So my colleague Koos wrote a blog article about it that you can see here on the screen, and you can work with those systems. Now, if you're engineering something new, you can also take the C# code, PowerShell, Python, Go, and any of the other examples to, for instance, use the HTTP data collector API that allows you to ingest any data into Azure Sentinel, or actually into the log analytics workspace behind it, and then make sure that you have those events. So do have a look at the Microsoft docs if you're trying to ingest something custom. The HTTP data collector API is well documented. There's samples for all of these languages, and you can just take these and really get a sample of how to do this. Okay, so we have Azure Sentinel set up. We have these connectors that now allow us to flow data in. What's next? Well, there's something we call the analytics, and the analytics could be seen as the alert rules. So you want to make sure that something is detected on top of this data. You want to understand when there's RDP scans, when rogue processes are created, when things are happening in your environment that tend to be malicious. And Microsoft delivers a lot of analytic rule templates out of the box that you can just use on top of the connectors they provide. But there's also a vibrant community, and I'll talk about that in a second, that allows you to add rules that they've already created based on their experience and their work. But of course, you can also create these alert rules from scratch and really make sure that you engineer some of these detections for your environment. Now, because they are KQL based, you can just create a query ahead of time, understand whether or not you're triggering on the right data, and then use that as part of an alert rule. Here are some samples on screen. You see, for instance, a join statement where I'm combining data from Microsoft Cloud App Security together with sign-in logs from Azure AD. We filter down to the IP address ranges of our offices, and we start to understand whether or not sign-in activity is malicious. And that is something that's easy to do. But you can also create very complex queries, and that's here on the right-hand corner, and I'll submit them to GitHub so you can see them. But those are things you can do, multiple joins, multiple unions, across workspaces even, and then really get some information back on top of all of this security data. Now, talking about the community, if you go to github.com/azure/azure-sentinel, you'll see a lot of information being published primarily by a lot of the Microsoft folks, but also you'll see third-party people from the community like yourself, really helping out to engineer some of these detections. You can take this, for instance, the hunting queries, if they are of use to you, and some of these things are experimental or something that you can have a look at as inspirational purposes. There's information, for instance, on getting data from Zoom. There's information from logging data from GitHub, from Azure DevOps. All of these things you can just take and add them to your Azure Sentinel instance and get those detections up and running. So I certainly encourage you to have a look at this repo. And if you've created some alert rules, please do file a pull request so that we can learn from you as well. Now, a couple of people from the community, Eduardo Gerosa and Olaf Hartong, who's also a Microsoft MVP, engineered a project called Sentinel Attack. And that's something that's built on top of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And the MITRE ATT&CK is a non-profit organization that tries to describe all of these types of attack vectors that could occur. And on top of this, they've worked with Sysmon data, and as you might know, Sysmon is a tool you can take for free, to really go beyond what's delivered out of the box. You can fork this project, import it into your Azure Sentinel instance. You get 117 rules extra, and there's even Terraform scripts for a lab if you want to try it out. So this is something to have a look at, and the link is at the end of my presentation, and I'll also post it to my Twitter timeline. So I encourage you to have a look, and thank you, Eduardo and Olaf, for all the great work. Now, you might think, okay, there's so many rules, and if I have multiple workspaces, if I'm doing work for multiple clients, or maybe I just want to set up a CI/CD pipeline to really automatically work with all of these alert rules. Well, good, we've engineered an Azure Sentinel PowerShell module you can take for free from the PowerShell gallery. And this is something that allows you to programmatically work with all of that data in Azure Sentinel. So you can update alerts, create rules, and many more things. Currently, we're at 0.65 version. And Javier from Microsoft Services actually created a blog called Deploying and Managing Azure Sentinel as Code. So if you want to deploy instances and manage your Azure Sentinel as code, have a look at this blog. It uses the CI/CD pipeline from Azure DevOps, and it takes the Azure PowerShell module to pretty much automate it from back to front and make sure that you get an automated installation. Now, these analytic rules, these alert rules will raise an alert for you if something suspicious is happening. But I think that everybody knows that it might be a hard thing to go through hundreds of alerts. So it might be chasing your tail. If you're in a big organization, These products will usually give you a couple of alerts per hour, per day maybe, because of, let's say, unusual sign-in activity. Maybe somebody's using a VPN, maybe somebody's traveling, maybe the ISP switched the IP address, and now the product will give you an unusual sign-in. And if this is something you need to follow up manually, this might take a bit of time, takes 10 to 15 minutes to confirm. And if you have 100 standing by, this might take too much time because then you can't focus on the things that really matter. So one of the things that Azure Sentinel adds to this equation is the fact that we can now create use cases. So we can connect multiple products, and these multiple products give us alerts, but we try and correlate 2 or more alerts to really give you a proper true positive and not all of these potentially false positives. So let's consider this example. We have Azure Sentinel running, we're logging from Azure AD, the sign-in logs, maybe we have our network equipment sending data in, Defender A2P on the endpoint, looking at things happening there, and maybe Office A2P or Cloud App Security, looking at some of our public properties, like our Office Online. So at 9:13, an unusual login happens from Austria. And in it by itself might not be something, and it might be a false positive. But let's say that our network equipment is telling that this specific login is from an anonymous IP address, a Tor exit, and that already raises suspicion because Tor is typically not used for a lot of legal things, I would say. Now, the third alert that could be added to the equation is, what if about a half an hour later we see on the endpoint that's targeted a suspicious PowerShell script executed? Defender A2P gives us this alert, and now we get to a P1 security alert, and maybe a couple of minutes later we see Office A2P and MCAS telling us that an inbox forwarding rule was created, and well, now we have to correlate these events, and it really tells us, well, there is a potential data exfiltration happening and something that we need to follow up with a lot of speed and priority. And this is what a use case is. It's correlating 2 or more events, 2 or more sources to give you a proper context of a broader attack happening, but also reducing false positives and really letting you focus on all of the true positives and things you need to potentially follow up with. This is an example of how this looks in the product. Compromised account leading to Office 365 mailbox exfiltration, giving you all the 4 alerts and even the information of what user to which email address it's being forwarded. A really, really powerful feature. Now, building these alert rules and these analytics is something you can do with KQL. You saw the extensive query a couple of slides back, so you could join these things yourself. But we also talked about machine learning being part of Azure Sentinel. And that's something we, or the Microsoft product team, calls Azure Sentinel Fusion, where it fuses information and data together to give you a broader context. These are typically pre-built machine learning models, again, from extensive experience that Microsoft has in their own platforms, so it's battle tested. It's about you creating correlated rules with KQL. It's also about bringing your own machine learning models, and we'll talk about that in a second. And it's about user entity behavior analytics, looking at user behavior or things we today call insider risk and understanding the activities of our user. So this is Azure Sentinel Fusion. What Microsoft does, it takes alerts to high fidelity incidents from multiple security products. So it looks at network events, identity events, mailbox events, endpoint events, millions, if not billions of them. It then applies probabilistic kill chain machine learning to really reduce them to maybe tens of incidents that could be candidates. And then it applies another layer of machine learning based on priority scoring to go down to about a handful of high fidelity incidents. And these are then brought to your attention in the Azure Sentinel UI. And all of this logic is done behind the scenes. No need for you to configure Databricks clusters or other potentially interesting stuff. But you can just rely on enabling this rule and the machine learning will be enabled. Now here's an example of something called the Advanced Multi-Stage Attack Detection, AMAD. It takes Azure AD Identity Protection, Cloud App Security, again, a lot of products, and then looks at persistence, lateral movement, exfiltration of data, or even command and control channels to understand traffic. This is just in the box, you enable it and it does the magic for you. So you get information as long as you have Azure AD Identity Protection, as long as you have MCAS, this thing will do its magic. So go ahead, enable those things and you'll be quite happy to see what it brings you. Now, talking about bringing, you can bring your own. So if you're a data scientist, if you have affinity with building machine learning models, if you work with PyTorch, if you know your Jupyter, maybe understand Databricks, you can work with the data in Azure Sentinel or essentially in log analytics. The Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center has built a couple of libraries for you that are under GitHub repo, so you don't need to do all of the extensive work to get the data in and out or some of the scoring mechanisms. You can just use those libraries in your Databricks environment and then use that custom data, push it into Azure Sentinel and use it in your alert rule. So let's say for this access to this file share, I want to be detected with a score higher than 8. I can just create a KQL rule based on that column that you see here on screen. So this isn't a possibility, but a session in and by itself to explain how this works in detail. Now, the UEBA, the User Entity and Behavior Analytics, the insider risk, if you will, is something that's done in conjunction with Microsoft 365. So the technology, the core of the platform is in Microsoft 365. It looks at all of the things happening in that platform, combines it with other sources from the endpoint, for instance, with Defender, and then tries and understand whether or not through patterns somebody's doing something malicious, maybe on the last day before resignation or leaving the company, copying bulk of data with some confidential documents in between them, things that they potentially shouldn't have done, and then raises an insider threat alert. Those things will carry over to Azure Sentinel and then become input for our security use cases. But also in the near future, the Azure Sentinel UI will be extended so that you can pivot off of a user, pivot off of a resource, and really understand whether or not there's any insider risks to take into account. So this is something that's coming really quickly. If you want to see it today, go to Microsoft 365 Insider Risk, and you can already see the technology in work. Okay, so we've got alerts raising, but then we need to understand false positive, true positive, maybe do some investigation, some hunting, and really narrow down whether or not somebody's doing something and whether or not that's bad. Now, Microsoft Azure Sentinel helps you to visually investigate. So you can right-click an alert, say investigate, and it pops up this UI. It centers the alert and then takes any of the entities, maybe a user, maybe a pass service, and gives you information of the IP addresses that it accessed, some of the other things that are involved. And on the right-hand side, there's like a mini notebook that allows you to also take some of these things forward if you're doing a longer investigation. You can also dive deeper. If you want to understand more about a certain user or a certain resource, you can right-click and say, give me the related alerts, maybe some IP logins from rare locations, some of the Office activity if it's a user, and again, aid you in visually investigating this alert without going into some of the manual things you could do. Now, talking about manual, that of course would be largely supported by the KQL queries that you can do in the log analytics workspace. Let's say you have a lot of data and you want to understand if there's any anomalies, any weird things happening in that pattern of data. You can just take very, very powerful commands like the time series data and say, I want to have a look at, in this case, some network traffic. Give me a decomposition of all the total bytes sent over the past, let's say, month or so, and render a time chart and give me some of that visually representation of the data. And you see here, I've marked it with some of the circles, that we see spikes of data standing out. So at that point in time, more data was sent than regularly happens. And this could potentially mean data exfiltration, something else. So another point of interest to look at. And there's a really powerful feature when you're in KQL to right-click that data, add it as a hunting bookmark, and again, it will show up in your mini notebook to give you a more chronological representation of all of the things that you're investigating. Now, okay. Test. And we're back. Well, thanks everybody for hanging in. The microphone batteries were switched, so thank you, Henk. We were at hunting, so we looked at the visual representation, we looked at what KQL brings you, but maybe you want to go even more advanced, you want to dive even deeper. Maybe there's other systems you need to query, maybe there are things that this investigation will take weeks and weeks for you to uncover what's happening. Now, do understand that we love Jupyter notebooks. If you're a Visual Studio Code fan, and I wouldn't know why you're not a Visual Studio Code fan, there's a Python add-in, of course, that you can use that supports the Jupyter notebooks. And the Jupyter notebooks has some really great plugins or libraries that you can use to work with the Azure Sentinel data. And the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center team published a lot of blogs and a lot of great examples on how to do this. And again, if you go to my blog page, you'll see some examples as well. So do have a look at Visual Studio Code, Jupyter notebooks, and Azure Sentinel in combination to allow you to do some of that advanced hunting. Okay, so we've got these alerts, but we want to act upon those. And maybe you're not awake at 3 a.m. watching the virtual Azure Community Day, but you're sleeping and you want to make sure that the system is acting on your behalf. Well, enter stage Playbooks. These are really just Azure Logic apps that you can apply to these Azure Sentinel alerts. You can do what you already do in Azure Logic apps, take any of that information, build a trigger, let's say a certain alerts happen, and I want to block a user, maybe isolate an endpoint, maybe update an NSG or an Azure firewall, things you can already do in Azure Logic app, and then apply those forward to the alerts in Azure Sentinel. Now, this is something called Playbooks and something that's very powerful, and you can use it today. Here's an example of an Azure Logic app where we're taking the alert, then we're sending an email, and we're using the voting buttons in Outlook to really get an option from the administrator whether or not we want to block this user based on the information that we have. Now, we take an advanced example for which we will need Azure Sentinel in combination with Defender ATP. We can actually have an advanced playbook. So let's say there's a new indicator of compromise, a new IP address or a new file hash we found out today that it's rogue and that malicious people are behind this. So that threat intelligence is something we want to act upon. We want to make sure that none of our endpoints have communicated with those IPs in the past 30 days. And if they did, we want to isolate those endpoints and follow up with the response team, obviously. So what we can do is take that information, those IOCs, push them into the Security Graph API, for instance, through MISP, MyMeld, any of the threat intelligence platforms that you might know of. Then, of course, act upon that information. So start on a security playbook that will then query the Defender ATP to understand whether or not some of these endpoints had been communicating with that IP address. And if they did, isolate them, which is a function that's built into Defender ATP. Then send an email, maybe raise an alert in Azure Sentinel and get your response team off and going. Now, these are things that you can do just in a couple of minutes by building Azure Logic apps and essentially playbooks into Azure Sentinel. All right, time for a demo. Bear with me if we switch to the browser. So I'm in my tenant. I have an Azure Sentinel workspace set up. And it's loading, and it's called Azure Sentinel. And we're brought into the home page when we click on this. It will give us information about the last 24 hours, or we can set a custom time range, let's say the last month, and get an at-a-glance information about how many incidents occurred, maybe some of the data sources that have anomalies. So we see security events going up previously the last 2 days. We see what types of events we're getting in and much more. Now, like we talked in the presentation, the first thing you'll likely do is enable some of these data connectors, and there's even 54 is what we see now. 54 connectors, of which I have 14 connected and 1 is coming soon. And we can have a look, let's say, at the Azure Activity connector. The Azure Activity is something where Azure Resource Manager and the platform gives us events back on what's happening in our tenants and in our subscriptions. And we see that we have 265 events sent to us in the past, 24 hours. And that there is a table called Azure Activity that we can then have a look at. And if we click on Next Steps, we'll get some examples how to work with this data. For instance, let me zoom in. We can do a KQL query and give us results, and apparently the table is called Azure Activity. And there's some analytic templates that we can use, for instance, for known attack groups, maybe suspicious number of resources created or deleted. And these are things that we can just take and work with out of the box that Microsoft gives us as part of this connector framework. There's also generic connectors. So if we scroll down to, for instance, syslog, here we go. Then we see that if we open up the connector page, that we can send in syslogs through an agent. We have 11 analytic rules templates that are provided to us. There's even a workbook, and we have some data that was sent to us in the past couple of days, about 1 million events. So the network traffic is generating a lot of events. And these are things we can use as generic connectors. So Windows events, any event log in the system, syslog, Linux logs, and so forth are generic items we can take into Azure Sentinel. And again, we talked about Amazon. If we go to the AWS connector page here, you'll see that we can connect to your CloudTrail instance, and mine is connected, so it's sending in events from the AWS platform, and my IAM role is connected. And again, we get some analytic rules out of the box. So like failed AWS console logins, maybe MFA was disabled for some users. Those are things we can just take as part of this connector that we get. Now, we already saw workbooks, and you might have seen them from Azure Monitor. So Azure workbooks are like dashboards essentially. And if you can see it, I'll zoom it in. There's 67 you get out of the box, but you can create some of your own very easily through, again, the KQL query syntax. And if we go to the AWS one, we open up the workbook, we'll see that we get data visualized from our data source CloudTrail. So a lot of events happening. I generated quite a bit of activity, but no malicious activity, luckily. And these are things that allow us to give us some more information about the things happening in our environment. Now, going to the analytic rules, there's a tab called Rule Templates. And here are all the alert rules that you can use. So there's many. The things you can take, for instance, for security events, for Office 365, some of the other third parties like Semantic, Infoblox, Proofpoint, you name it, there's things here. And again, you could go to the GitHub repo to get even more. Now, going to some of the rules that I created, I can go to, let's say, this one, and it tells me it's called T1053, scheduled task was created, which is still a valid attack vector by many attack groups for persistence. The scheduled task is something where we just take events, or any of the security events, we filter down, and this will actually then give us information whether or not a scheduled task was created on resources in our environment. Now let's have a look at the incidents. Let me filter down. I'll do a custom time range. I'll narrow it down from May 1st. And then go to severity medium. And we should have some information here. So there's a lot of events happening. There's a test environment, but I can also say file and filter on specific events happening. And this tells us file backups were deleted. All files or shadow copies were deleted on some asset. And it's trying to collect all the information that's part of this incident. And then we will get a button called Investigate here in the bottom right corner. Clicking on Investigate will then take us into this investigation, and I'll zoom in a bit. And what we see is this is the incident. File backups were deleted. We see that there was a user involved called Mike Howland, and Mike apparently has a username in Azure AD. And if we click on Mike, we actually get this context menu giving us the option to look at related alerts. So we see that Mike has many more alerts. So this will give us more information if we want to pivot into those alerts. Why is there, for instance, a block test? We could click on block test and give us information about these related entities. And we see that there's actually things happening on his endpoint in Microsoft Edge communication with rogue IP addresses that potentially shouldn't have happened, which desktop computer is involved, etc., etc. So this really allows you to visualize. And if I go to timeline, you now also see that there's some sort of timeline happening. We even see process execution from alternate data streams. So again, allowing you to really easily work with the data. Now, if you need to go a bit deeper, we can, of course, go hunting. So there's this option hunting, and we get some of the hunting queries that Microsoft provides you, about 92 that we get for these connectors. I can say run all queries, and on the column results, you'll see whether or not some of these things triggered. So it's running the results, and then if we scroll down, there's one called rare audit activity initiated by user. That actually gives us 2 hits. And if we look at view results, we can dive deeper. And again, this is a bit advanced, but allows us to work with all of the data that's in the workspace and maybe understand a bit better of what's happening. Well, in this case, we see that there's some authentication that's being set for this user where we need to have a look at whether or not this was a true positive or something just malicious happening. Now we can also just do some custom work. So we've built our own honeypot network. If I go to custom logs, there's a honeypot table. Those are resources that mimic a real application, but they are really not. They're just trying to get your IP address and the things you're trying to do on this resource so that we know better on what an attacker is trying to do. So we can say honeypot where raw data contains, let's say, SSH. We get all of the attempts where people are trying to SSH into that computer. And we can just take one of those items and expand it a bit more. And we get information on the password, the IP address, and the things they're trying to do on this PC. So, and we can set a hunting bookmark from here and really work with the data. So that's pretty cool. There's also this option called Community. It's a node in Azure Sentinel. So if you don't know how to get to the GitHub repo, click on this button. You go into github.com/Azure/Azure Sentinel, and here's all of the information, some of the things that you can take into Azure Sentinel as extra information. So this in a nutshell is Azure Sentinel and how to use it. So let's quickly switch back to the presentation one more time. One of the things that's interesting to know is that Azure Sentinel can be used standalone. So you can take Azure Sentinel, send in data from any of the properties you have, but you can also use it alongside with some of the Microsoft 365 and E5 products. So for instance, with Office ATP, trying to detect phishing and some of the rogue access to other websites. We can have a look at exploitation, command and control from Microsoft Defender ATP and have a look at that part of the kill chain. Have a look at Azure AD Identity Protection for the online accounts. Azure ATP if you want to have coverage of your Active Directory forest, your domain, and whether or not users are compromised there or some rogue events happening like DC Shadow, for instance, or pass the hash or golden tickets. And Cloud App Security to understand your data exfiltration. Now for all of these products, we have connectors into Azure Sentinel. Getting these into Azure Sentinel allow you to really cover all of these parts of the cyber kill chain and getting you a bigger picture of all of the things happening in your environment. Now, if you're really interested into a real world scenario, and one of the things you could have a look at is a session I recorded about the University of Maastricht. They had a cyber malware attack just before Christmas last year. It crippled the whole university. They were down for about 4 to 6 weeks. They paid ransom, about 200,000 euros, to get the decryption keys. And there was a big debate whether or not that was a good thing and whether or not we're then supporting this malicious industry. But I will take you through the timeline, give you information on what's happening, how Microsoft security products could have helped, and give you a behind the scenes. And the link is in the deck, and I'll post it to Twitter as well. So I encourage you to have a look at this video if you want to understand more and get a real world scenario case. So I fully agree with Forrester. They quoted last year, "Make no mistake, Microsoft is a security company now." And there's a link to the article here below. Microsoft is making huge strides in this area. We're getting a lot of coverage around this, along of the cyber kill chain, and these services are for you to use with Azure Sentinel. So I encourage you to have a look. If this went by too quickly, I've written an Azure Sentinel ebook for free again. The link is in the deck. Take it. It's about 130 pages of Azure Sentinel awesome sauce. And you can look at this and get some more information if it went by too quick. Here's a list of the resources: the Sentinel Attack, the Advanced Hunting with Jupyter, AWS Session, the PowerShell module, some of the custom security logging. Well, if you can't get enough, here's a link to my blog. I'm also doing a podcast called The Security Insiders. We're going behind the scenes with the legal counsel from Microsoft Redmond, with the team behind Azure Sentinel Fusion, some of the great MVPs and other experts like Olaf Hartong. So I encourage you to have a look at the podcast, and thank you for watching.
So, thanks Maarten for your great session.
Happy
Went
to
well.
be
Yeah, yeah. We do have a couple of questions.
Oh, great.
And one question is, what are you hoping for that the Sentinel team will be working on next?
I think one of my desires would be to get even more connectors in, because having everything centrally is important, and there's still a few gaps we can fill, so I'm hoping to get some more connectors. Microsoft acquired last month a company called CyberX that is into OT, so not IT but OT, so like the industrial automation, like factories and such. Mm-hmm. So we'll likely be seeing in the next couple of years, I'm hoping to get the OT security in. Nice. That will be an exciting era, like not only IoT but full OT. So data connector short term, OT long term.
Okay, sounds cool. And is there a roadmap available publicly for Sentinel?
There are some links that Microsoft published on their tech community blogs where they're outlining what they're working on next. So potentially we could put them somewhere online in the tweet timeline to make sure that people have links to those blogs where some of those things are written down.
Okay, cool. You also showed a couple of logic apps. Are there examples out in the open for that?
Or are they the GitHub repo?
Also on the GitHub repo.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Nice.
you don't get them out of the box in the UI, but if you go to github.com, the repo from Azure Sentinel, you can take a couple of examples, import them because they're just JSON files, I think they are, right? Yeah. And you could just import them into your as an Azure Logic app and apply them to Azure Sentinel.
Okay, cool. Do you have any questions, Mark?
First I need to highlight, thank you for mentioning the KQL language and the Pluralsight training. I think that it's very valuable.
Kudos to Robert.
Very good information. But how do you think that organizations are moving more and more to DevOps and owning the system, and also then including owning the security aspects of it? So how do you see that happening now? Do you already see organizations really moving into that security scene more and being able to write these advanced KQL queries, or is it still very much not really mature yet and still growing?
I think security is still quite immature, to be honest. It's often an afterthought. That we're spending a lot of time and energy on building systems and maintaining them, and then once we get hit by security issues, the priority does go up. Right. But we see the most mature organization making like a DevSecOps push or something in that area, where they're trying to make it part of their CI/CD process, or create landing zones and such that are secure by default. So I would say the more mature organizations are heavily invested, and like Javier did in his blog on Microsoft, is that he's programmatically even creating Azure Sentinel stuff, and I could imagine that some of the development folks would do the same thing.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Lots of room to grow, but it's definitely going the right direction.
Lots of room to grow.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you. We're going out for a short break again, and I'm also signing off for this conference. So I hope you enjoyed it all so far, and Suzanne will take over my place from the next session on. We have Stacey Cashmore next, so stay tuned.
Thanks, Sherky.